Jean Hurley felt the weight of her life in every step. She was only 20, yet the responsibilities she carried were staggering. 3 exhausting jobs, 2 younger siblings relying on her, and a seemingly endless series of bills that left her constantly calculating, constantly sacrificing. She had long since stopped believing that life would offer any surprises. But that night, on her way home, fate intervened. Crossing a nearly empty street, Jean noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, a man cornered by 2 figures, half-shrouded in the shadows of an alley. The man's face was tense with fear, his suit rumpled as he backed up, helpless against his attacker's demands. For a split second, Jean froze. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to avoid trouble. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and pragmatism, something deeper surfaced, a pulse of bravery that came perhaps from having nothing left to lose. Without allowing herself to think it through, Jean rushed toward a parked car nearby and slammed her hand down on the horn, filling the night air with the piercing sound of the siren. The men turned sharply, their gazes snapping to her, startled and unprepared for the interruption. The sound reverberated, bouncing off the brick walls of the alley, and for a moment, everyone stood motionless, locked in each other's stares. Then, realizing they had attracted unwanted attention, the 2 assailants cursed under their breaths and disappeared into the darkness. Jean approached the man, her pulse still racing, but with relief gradually overtaking the adrenaline. She took a deep breath, feeling the strange mix of exhilaration and dread. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice breathy but steady. The man, still catching his breath, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He was older than her, likely in his late 40s, with a sharp but worn face and eyes that held a complex blend of intelligence and vulnerability. Yes, I'm fine," he stammered, straightening his jacket. "Thanks to you." He stopped, looking at her with a stunned admiration. "Thank you, truly thank you." He extended a hand, hesitant but sincere. "Robert Reynolds." Jean nodded, shaking his hand, feeling slightly awkward with the formality of it all. Jean Hurley. He took in her appearance, young, visibly tired but resolute, with an air about her that spoke of struggle and determination. Something about her fascinated him. "Jean," he repeated, as if trying to commit it to memory. "I'm still processing this. You saved me, you know." A slight, self-conscious smile appeared on Jean's face as she brushed off the sentiment. It wasn't that big of a deal. Just, right place at the right time. "No, it was more than that," he replied, a genuine warmth in his voice. "I don't know many people who would have done what you did. At the very least, I owe you some kind of gratitude." Jean shook her head, already backing away. "It's all right. Really, just be careful." She turned, ready to leave, eager to escape before the moment became too strange, too complicated. "Good night." But Robert wasn't ready to let the encounter end. "Jean, wait." She paused, glancing back at him, her face shadowed in uncertainty. "At least let me do something for you. I'd feel better if I could repay you." Jean hesitated, but then her instincts kicked in. She didn't have time for promises or vague offers. "It's fine. Just stay safe, okay?" And with that, she walked away, letting the silence settle between them. Strich. The next morning, Jean resumed her life as usual, starting her day early at the small restaurant where she worked. She was cleaning tables, her mind already spinning with thoughts of her siblings' school needs and overdue bills, when a murmur went through the room. Glancing up, she saw the man from last night, Robert Reynolds, standing at the entrance, his gaze fixed on her, eyes gleaming with an unmistakable determination. Customers and staff alike stared, likely wondering what a man like him was doing in a place like this. Jean's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially not here. She wiped her hands on her apron, meeting his eyes as he approached her. "Jean," he said, a note of relief in his voice, as if he'd been hoping she would be here. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night. I know you wanted nothing in return, but I can't leave it at that." Jean took a deep breath, feeling the attention of the entire restaurant on them. "Mr. Reynolds, you really don't need to come here. I was just helping." "Call me Robert," he insisted with a small smile. "And I do need to be here. You saved me, Jean. Please, let me at least offer you something that might help you." She shook her head, feeling cornered. I have a job here, and I have 2 younger siblings to take care of. I can't just accept favors." "Jean," he interrupted gently, his voice calm but insistent. "I'm not offering a favor. I'm offering an opportunity." He paused, his expression softening as he glanced around the modest restaurant. "I could use someone with your courage and presence of mind. And I believe it could make a real difference in your life." His words struck a nerve. Jean thought of Noah and Olivia, thought of the mounting expenses, the way every day felt like a battle just to survive. Her instinct was to say no, to pull away from any connection that seemed too good to be true. "I don't know," she replied cautiously. "I'm needed here, and I don't think I can just change everything." "I understand," Robert said patiently, sensing her hesitance. "But Jean, I genuinely believe you deserve a chance to do something better, something that won't leave you so worn down." He glanced at her hands, chapped from endless hours of work, then looked back into her eyes. "You were there when I needed help. Let me be there for you now." Jean's defenses began to waver. She glanced around, feeling the pressure of eyes on her, but his words planted a tiny spark of hope within her, a glimpse of what life could be like if it weren't such an endless struggle. After a long silence, she finally exhaled. "Allrecht, Robert. I'll listen to what you have in mind." A small triumphant smile appeared on his face, and he nodded. "Thank you, Jean. I think this will be the beginning of something good." Jean's first week as Robert's personal assistant felt like being thrown into a whirlpool. The building itself was imposing, and the offices were always abuzz with people who moved quickly, spoke confidently, and seemed to understand a world of business jargon that felt like a foreign language to her. Each day she arrived early, her nerves twisted with anticipation, bracing herself for the next wave of challenges that seemed endless. Every task was a test of her patience and resilience. From handling calls for Robert to organizing his calendar and managing documents that covered everything from financial projections to complex legal files, Jean found herself constantly playing catch-up. She knew one misstep could cost her the job, or worse, make Robert regret his decision to hire her. The pace was brutal. Jean felt that every time she finished one task, there were 3 more waiting. The meetings, in particular, were overwhelming. Each one felt like a battlefield, where the language was rapid and sharp, filled with financial terms and decisions she barely understood. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the room saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this polished world of executives and deals. And there was one person in particular who made that feeling unavoidable: Victoria Bennett. Victoria was the director of operations and had an air of authority that she wielded like a weapon. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with a gaze that could turn stone to ice, Victoria had made no secret of her distaste for Jean. Though Victoria rarely spoke to her directly, Jean could feel her judgment in every glance, a piercing reminder that she was being evaluated, scrutinized, and most likely found lacking. One morning, as Jean tried to navigate Robert's convoluted filing system, she sensed someone watching her. She turned to find Jason Miller, a colleague whose kind face and easy smile had been a small but welcome relief in the hectic office. He held a stack of documents and gave her a sympathetic smile. "You look like you're ready to throw those files out the window," Jason said, chuckling. Jean let out a frustrated sigh, shaking her head. If only that would solve everything. "Trust me, I've been there," Jason said, moving to stand beside her. He placed his files on the desk and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I know it feels like chaos now. The first week is always overwhelming, especially in Robert's office. But it does get easier. Once you find your rhythm, things start to make more sense." She gave him a hopeful but skeptical look. "I'm not so sure about that. Right now, I feel like I'm just barely staying afloat." Jason grinned. "That's normal. Robert has a way of diving into 20 projects at once. But you're doing better than you think. Just keep focusing on one thing at a time." Jean let out a relieved sigh. "Thanks, Jason. I really don't want to mess this up. I can't afford to fail here." "You won't," he said, his voice reassuring. "Robert wouldn't have hired you if he didn't see potential. Just give yourself some time to adjust." As she returned to her tasks, Jason's words provided a small boost of confidence. But her relief was short-lived. Just as she was beginning to feel a bit more comfortable, she felt the familiar, icy presence of Victoria. The director of operations stood across the room, watching Jean intently. When Jean looked up, Victoria strode over, her heels clicking on the polished floor with an air of calculated intimidation. Victoria's voice was smooth, but carried a sharp edge. "I hope you're not expecting any special treatment here, Jean. Everyone in this office has had to prove themselves. Jean met her gaze, fighting to keep her composure. I understand that. Victoria's mouth curled into a faint, mocking smile. Good. Because I still don't understand why Robert brought you in. But I suppose he'll realize his mistake soon enough. Jean forced herself to stay silent, swallowing the bitter response that sat on the tip of her tongue. She had expected skepticism, even judgment, but Victoria's open disdain was a deeper cut. She knew she was the outsider here, but every encounter with Victoria made her feel more vulnerable. For the rest of the day, Victoria's words replayed in her mind. It became clear to Jean that Victoria saw her as an intruder, a threat to the control she held over her team and perhaps over Robert. But instead of letting it discourage her, Jean used that doubt to fuel her focus. She doubled down, determined not to let anyone, especially Victoria, see her falter. By the end of the week, Robert called Jean into his office. He had just ended a meeting, his tie slightly loosened, and he looked up at her with a faint smile as she entered. Jean, how's the first week treating you? He asked, his tone casual but curious. Jean hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It's a lot to take in, but I'm trying to keep up. Robert's eyes softened slightly. This job isn't easy, especially in the beginning. I know the environment can be intense. She nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. I want to do well here, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity. I just don't want to disappoint you. He regarded her thoughtfully. I have no doubt you'll rise to the challenge. Just remember, you don't have to figure everything out on day 1. Or even day 50. Take your time. Jean left his office feeling slightly more grounded, but her challenges were far from over. Victoria's disapproval lingered, a constant reminder of her precarious place in this new world. But each day, Jean grew a little stronger, her resolve hardening. She knew that if she could withstand the pressure here, she could build a life that her siblings could be proud of. As she settled back into her tasks, her mind wandered to Noah and Olivia. She thought of Noah, who'd become increasingly distant, and Olivia, who dreamed of dancing in a place far removed from the struggles they all knew. This job was her lifeline, her chance to give them something better. And so, she resolved to push through, no matter what challenges came next. The weight of Jean's responsibilities pressed harder as the days went by. She was juggling an entirely new world at work, where each day was a fresh test of her resilience, but at home, things were unraveling in ways that kept her up at night. Her 16-year-old brother Noah was slipping into behaviors that worried her more than she wanted to admit. He'd become distant, staying out later, coming home with a new defiant attitude that wasn't like him. She knew she needed to confront him, even though the idea left her tense. They used to talk openly, but now, each conversation felt like approaching a minefield. One evening, after he'd returned home much later than usual, she caught him slipping into the living room, his hoodie pulled up and his gaze downcast. She waited until he'd shrugged off his jacket and shoes before clearing her throat. Noah, we need to talk, she said, her voice calm but firm. She crossed her arms, watching him closely. He avoided her gaze, rolling his eyes as he leaned against the arm of the couch. Can't this wait? He muttered, his voice cold, almost indifferent. No, it can't, Jean replied, trying to keep her frustration in check. Where have you been? You've been coming home late every night. I'm getting worried. He huffed, crossing his arms defensively. It's not your business where I go. Not my business. Jean's tone sharpened, her patience slipping. I'm the one responsible for you, Noah. You can't just vanish every night and come back whenever you feel like it. Noah's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked at her with a flash of resentment she hadn't seen before. You're not our mom, Jean. Stop acting like you get to tell me what to do. His words landed like a blow, leaving Jean speechless for a moment. She struggled to find the right response, forcing herself to breathe slowly to stay calm. I know I'm not mom, she said quietly. But I'm trying to do what's best for us, what's best for you. He looked away, his face hardening as he grabbed his hoodie and stormed toward his bedroom without another word, leaving her standing alone. Jean felt the ache of the widening distance between them, knowing that he was slipping further from her reach, and she was terrified of losing him to whatever influences had started creeping into his life. Amid the strain with Noah, Olivia, her 12-year-old sister, was her solace. Olivia still looked up to her, still brought moments of lightness to Jean's days, and lately, she had discovered a passion that made her eyes sparkle: dance. Whenever Olivia spoke about dancing, her whole face lit up, her words coming faster as she described the moves she wanted to try, the music she imagined herself moving to. She would pirouette and leap around their small living room, full of energy and joy. For Jean, those moments were a balm, a reminder of why she was fighting so hard to hold everything together. One night, as she tidied up after dinner, Jean found herself watching Olivia try out a clumsy but enthusiastic spin across the floor. She laughed, unable to resist the infectious happiness her sister radiated. "You really love this, don't you?" Jean asked softly, smiling as Olivia came to a breathless stop. Olivia's cheeks flushed with excitement. "Yes. It's like, I feel free when I dance. Like nothing else matters." Jean's heart swelled with pride and a bittersweet pang. She wished she could give her sister the world, wished she could afford proper dance lessons that might nurture Olivia's talent. But the thought was quickly brushed aside. They barely had enough to get by as it was. The next day, during a quiet moment in the office, Jean found herself mentioning Olivia's passion for dance to Robert. It was one of those moments when the conversation had drifted away from work, and she let her guard down for a moment. "She's amazing, Robert," Jean said, smiling faintly as she remembered Olivia's determined practice routines. "She talks about dancing like it's the most important thing in the world. I wish I could give her the chance to really learn, but it's just not possible right now." Robert listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "You know," he said after a moment, "I could help with that if you'd like. I know a few people who could recommend a great teacher." Jean looked up, startled by his offer. "Robert, she hesitated, both grateful and conflicted. "That's incredibly generous, but I don't know if I can accept that." He shook his head gently, his expression warm. "Jean, this isn't charity. It's an investment, in Olivia, in her future. She deserves the chance to explore something she's passionate about, don't you think?" She swallowed, feeling a swell of gratitude she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you, Robert," she said quietly, her voice thick. "I don't know how I could ever repay you for this." He smiled, brushing off her thanks with a small wave. "You don't need to. Just promise me you'll let her pursue what she loves." Jean nodded, her heart brimming with both relief and emotion. It was as though a door had opened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a little light shining through the darkness of their everyday struggles. That night, Jean sat Olivia down, a soft smile on her face as she delivered the news. "Olivia," she began, watching her sister's curious expression, "how would you like to start real dance lessons?" Olivia's eyes widened, her jaw dropping as her face transformed from surprise to pure joy. "Are you serious?" I can really learn to dance." Jean laughed, her eyes welling up as she nodded. "Yes, Liv. There's a teacher who wants to help, and Robert is making sure you have this opportunity." Olivia threw her arms around Jean, her voice a joyful whisper in her ear. "Thank you, Jean. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me." As Olivia darted off to practice new moves, Jean's heart swelled. For once, she felt like she was able to give her sister something good, something worth hoping for. And even though accepting Robert's help meant relying on him more, the joy on Olivia's face made it all worth it. But as the night wore on, Jean's thoughts drifted back to Noah. His distance, his anger, lingered like a shadow in the back of her mind, a reminder that her battles were far from over. She knew she couldn't let him keep slipping away. Jean was beginning to find her footing in Robert's corporate world, juggling the challenges of her work with the growing pressure at home. Just as she allowed herself a sliver of confidence, believing that maybe, just maybe, things could settle down, she received a call to meet with Richard Campbell, one of Robert's most relentless business rivals. His name was notorious around the office, whispered in hushed tones, and Jean had only seen him from afar, looming over meetings with his sharp, calculating gaze. So when she was asked to attend a private meeting with him, a sense of foreboding tightened in her chest. As she entered the quiet conference room, Richard was already seated at the far end of the table, watching her approach with a chilling, confident smile. He motioned for her to sit across from him, and she settled in, feeling her pulse quicken as his eyes remained fixed on her, like a predator sizing up prey. "So," Richard began, his voice calm but laced with a hint of mockery, "you're the young assistant Robert has been so taken with." Jean tensed but forced herself to stay composed, meeting his gaze evenly. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Campbell. If there's something specific you'd like to discuss, please let me know." Richard's smirk deepened, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Oh, don't worry, Jean. I'm not here to waste either of our time with small talk. I like getting straight to the point." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a quiet, conspiratorial tone. "I've noticed you and Robert have become quite close." Jean felt her stomach twist, but she kept her face blank. "I don't know what you mean by that, Mr. Campbell. I'm Robert's assistant, nothing more." "Of course." He gave a slight nod, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing right through her. "But that's exactly why I wanted to speak with you, Jean. I have a bit of advice, let's call it friendly guidance." She raised an eyebrow, bracing herself. "And what advice would that be?" Richard leaned in, his smile vanishing as his tone grew menacingly low. "Be careful who you trust in this business. You're still new here, but if you've been paying attention, you know that Robert and I don't exactly see eye to eye. We're in a competition that goes far beyond the boardroom, and casualties aren't uncommon." Jean's skin prickled, but she held her ground, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her unnerved. "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," Richard replied smoothly, his lips curling back into a cold smile. "Consider it a warning. Robert isn't as straightforward as he might seem, and if you're not careful, you could find yourself tangled in matters far more dangerous than filing paperwork and answering phones." Jean's voice was steady, but she could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, but I think you do." Richard's eyes flashed with something dark, almost gleeful. "Robert has secrets, Jean. Dark secrets that, if they were to come to light, could ruin not only his career but everyone associated with him." He leaned back, observing her with a triumphant expression. "And that would be a shame for a young woman like you, someone with a family to protect." Jean's stomach dropped as he mentioned her family, and she felt an icy grip of fear take hold. "Leave my family out of this," she said quietly, her hands clenched in her lap to keep them from shaking. Richard's smile widened, satisfied that he'd struck a nerve. "I can't leave them out if you're putting them in harm's way by sticking around with Robert." He shrugged, as if he were offering her an obvious solution. "Walk away, Jean. Do the smart thing and leave before you're in too deep. Because if Robert goes down, he'll take everyone down with him, including you." Jean struggled to maintain her composure, swallowing hard. "I won't be intimidated by your threats, Mr. Campbell." "Threats?" Richard feigned surprise. No. Think of it as friendly advice." He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "But let's be clear, Jean. If you care about your family, I'd strongly advise you to listen carefully to what I'm saying." Jean fought the urge to look away, to break from his intense gaze, but she knew that any sign of weakness would only encourage him. "Is that all you wanted to tell me?" Richard smirked, seemingly amused by her defiance. "For now. But let me know if you change your mind about working with someone who actually has your interests in mind." He paused, letting his words sink in before standing up. "Good luck, Jean. You'll need it." With that, he strode out of the room, leaving her sitting alone, heart pounding in her chest. As she sat there, her mind raced. She felt a fierce loyalty to Robert. He'd trusted her, given her a way to support her family. But Richard's words had planted a seed of doubt. Could Robert really have secrets dangerous enough to endanger her and her family? In the following days, she couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. Richard's warning echoed in her thoughts, filling her with a dread that lingered each time she spoke with Robert. She knew she needed to tell someone, but who? And how could she explain her fears without sounding paranoid? Torn between loyalty and fear, Jean realized that she couldn't handle this alone. But as she weighed her options, she knew that confronting Robert directly was too risky. She needed guidance, someone with the insight to help her navigate this precarious situation. And there was only one person she trusted who might have the knowledge and wisdom to guide her: Tracy Mitchell, Robert's close friend and legal advisor. The decision made, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Jean couldn't shake the memory of Richard Campbell's threats, his words festering in her mind, gnawing at her thoughts. Every time she saw Robert at work, or every time he spoke with that casual confidence, she'd remember Richard's ominous warning: Robert has secrets. It was as if a veil had been drawn over everything she thought she knew. Days passed, and the weight of the secret she carried became unbearable. She knew she couldn't keep handling it on her own. After struggling with it in silence, she finally decided to confide in Tracy Mitchell, the one person in Robert's circle whom Jean felt she could trust. Tracy was not only a seasoned attorney but also a longtime friend of Robert's, wise, calm, and fiercely protective of those she cared about. Jean hoped that if anyone could help her, it would be Tracy. Late one evening, after hours, she knocked on the door to Tracy's office, heart pounding as she waited. Tracy looked up, surprised to see her. "Jean, is everything all right?" Her voice was gentle, yet immediately attuned to Jean's tense expression. Jean stepped inside, shutting the door carefully behind her, her hand shaking just enough to betray her nerves. "Tracy, she hesitated, trying to find the words, knowing how difficult it would be to explain. "I need to talk to you. It's about something Richard Campbell said to me." Tracy's face tightened with concern. "Richard Campbell?" She gestured for Jean to sit. "Tell me everything." Jean took a seat, looking down as she tried to collect her thoughts. The words finally tumbled out, raw and heavy. "A few days ago, Richard called me into a private meeting. He warned me to stay away from Robert, hinted that Robert has dangerous secrets, and that being around him would put me and my family at risk." She swallowed, her voice thick with the fear she'd been bottling up. "He said that if I wanted to protect my siblings, I should leave. He made it sound like he knew things that could destroy all of us." Tracy listened intently, her expression growing darker with each word. When Jean finished, she leaned forward, her eyes serious and unwavering. "Jean, listen to me," Tracy said, her voice strong but comforting. "Richard Campbell is a manipulator. He thrives on exploiting people's fears to gain power. He's been trying to undermine Robert for years, and he thinks he's found a way to use you to get what he wants." Jean took a shaky breath, grateful for the steadiness in Tracy's tone, but the fear still lingered. "But Tracy, what if he's telling the truth? What if there's something I don't know about Robert?" Tracy reached out, placing a reassuring hand over Jean's. "Jean, I've known Robert for a long time, both as a friend and as his attorney. If there were secrets that could harm you or your family, I'd be the first to tell you. Robert has his flaws, yes, but he's not dangerous, and he's not hiding anything that would ever put you in harm's way." Jean nodded, feeling a rush of relief at Tracy's certainty, though the fear still hadn't completely faded. "I want to believe that, but Richard was so convincing. It's like he knows exactly what I'm most afraid of." "That's what he does," Tracy said firmly. "Richard is a master at finding people's vulnerabilities and manipulating them. But that's not going to work here, not with you, and not with us. What he wants is for you to doubt Robert, to turn against him. And if you do that, you're handing him exactly what he wants." Jean's shoulders dropped, the weight easing slightly. Tracy's words grounded her, reassuring her that she wasn't navigating this alone. "So what do we do now?" Jean asked, her voice steadier but her eyes full of hope and anxiety. Tracy's gaze sharpened, a determined edge replacing her earlier gentleness. "We fight back. Richard has crossed a line by threatening you, and he needs to be held accountable. But we'll need to be careful, smart. This isn't just about protecting Robert, it's about protecting you and your family." Jean felt a surge of courage in Tracy's resolve. For the first time since her encounter with Richard, she felt a flicker of hope. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to keep my brothers safe." "And you will." Tracy nodded, her voice full of conviction. "I'll handle the legal side, but I'll need your help, Jean. We'll gather evidence, document every interaction you've had with Richard. If he tries anything else, I want you to tell me immediately." Jean nodded, feeling a strength she hadn't felt in weeks. "Thank you, Tracy. I didn't realize how much I needed this." Tracy squeezed her hand, her expression softening. "You're not alone in this, Jean. Remember that. Together, we'll make sure Richard doesn't get away with this." Jean's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Tracy. I don't know what I'd do without your help." "You're stronger than you think, Jean," Tracy said gently. "Don't forget that. Richard may try to intimidate you, but he can't win unless you let him." Jean left Tracy's office that night feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, she felt equipped to stand up against the threat Richard posed, knowing she had someone in her corner. With Tracy by her side, Jean was ready to fight for her family's safety, no matter what it took. Jean's life had become a balancing act on a razor's edge. Her work was a constant whirlwind of responsibilities, secrets, and strategies. And at home, The family she was fighting so hard to protect seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Noah, her 16-year-old brother, was becoming more distant, closed off, and worst of all, angry. She saw it in his eyes, the kind of anger that went deeper than rebellious teenage frustration. It was something heavier, simmering below the surface, and she feared what would happen if he couldn't find a way to let it out safely. Then came the call that made her stomach drop. Noah had been expelled. He had been caught in a fight so severe that the school couldn't ignore it. Jean felt a mixture of panic, anger, and helplessness, wondering where she had gone wrong and how she could reach him. But before she could even begin to figure out what to do, Robert called her, offering his help in a way she hadn't expected. Robert reached out to Noah himself, asking him to come by the office after hours. Jean was hesitant at first, worried that Noah would brush Robert off, but she hoped he might listen to someone who wasn't his sister. She waited anxiously as Robert and Noah sat in Robert's spacious, dimly lit office, an unlikely scene unfolding between the stern businessman and the rebellious teenager. Robert studied Noah as he sat slouched in the leather chair across from him, his gaze downcast and defiant. Robert knew the look well. It was the look of a young man who felt misunderstood and didn't trust anyone enough to show what he was truly feeling. "Jean told me what happened at school," Robert began, his tone calm but serious. "Want to tell me your side?" Noah scoffed, crossing his arms. "What's there to tell? I got in a fight. End of story." Robert nodded slowly, not pushing him. "I've been there, you know. When I was about your age, I felt like no one understood me either." Noah looked up, surprised, though he tried to mask it with indifference. "You? I doubt that. You probably had everything handed to you." Robert let out a small, knowing laugh. "Not even close. I didn't have much growing up. I had to work for everything, fight my way through just to be heard. I remember feeling like no one saw me, the real me." Noah's tough exterior softened just a fraction. He sat up a little straighter, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, well, I bet you didn't have people constantly treating you like a screw-up." Robert held Noah's gaze, unflinching. "I didn't have much of anyone believing in me. But I realized something. You can't spend your life proving people wrong. You've got to start proving yourself right." Noah was silent, the anger on his face shifting to something else, a vulnerability he rarely let anyone see. "It's just, everyone's already decided what I am, who I am. They think I'm just trouble, so why not be trouble? At least then, they're not disappointed." Robert took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. "Noah, the world will always try to put you in a box. People will tell you what you are before you've even had the chance to figure it out for yourself. But if you accept their version of you, you're letting them decide your future." For the first time, Noah's expression softened. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I don't want people to keep looking at me like I'm nothing, like I'll never be more than this." "Noah," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm, "you're already more than you realize. But if you want others to see it, you need to see it first. Start by believing that you're worth more than what anyone else thinks." Noah met Robert's eyes, a glimmer of something hopeful breaking through his hardened exterior. How do I even do that?" Robert leaned forward, his tone sincere. "It's one choice at a time. Start small. Prove to yourself that you're capable of change, that you're stronger than the anger that's weighing you down. And if you ever need help, I'm here. Jean's here. We're not giving up on you." Noah swallowed, nodding slowly. The weight of Robert's words settled in, and for the first time, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone in his fight. He glanced away, but a hint of gratitude flickered in his expression. "Thanks," he mumbled, almost reluctantly. "For, not thinking I'm just a lost cause." Robert smiled, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on Noah's shoulder. "You're far from a lost cause, Noah. I see a lot of potential in you. You just need to trust yourself enough to see it too." Noah gave a small nod, the beginnings of a genuine smile tugging at his lips. The anger in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a flicker of hope, a spark that Robert hoped would grow. As they wrapped up the conversation, Robert glanced at his watch, knowing that Noah had a long way to go but feeling hopeful that tonight had been a step in the right direction. Jean could barely contain her anxiety as she stepped into the boardroom, clutching the folder filled with evidence that she and Tracy had painstakingly gathered over the last few weeks. Every conversation, every threat, and every underhanded move Richard Campbell had made was documented, and this was her chance to expose it all. She looked across the room and saw him already seated at the far end of the table, his confident smirk fixed in place, oblivious to the storm that was about to come crashing down around him. As she moved to her seat, Robert gave her a brief nod, his gaze steady and reassuring. Tracy sat nearby, her calm presence a steadying force. Jean took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was there. This wasn't just about her. It was about protecting Robert, her siblings, and everything she'd fought so hard to build. When all the shareholders and executives had settled in, Robert addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice firm and calm. "There are serious matters to discuss today. We're here to review evidence of illicit activity within this organization, and Jean Hurley, my assistant, has been central to bringing these issues to light." Richard shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering as he glanced over at Jean, surprise flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. Jean rose slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she faced the room, turning toward Richard with resolve. "I've come forward because of the threats and manipulation that I've been subjected to by Richard Campbell," she announced, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Campbell has not only targeted me, but he has also jeopardized this entire organization for his own gain." The room fell silent. Richard's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl as he leaned forward, his voice laced with disdain. "This is absurd," he scoffed. "She's making accusations with no basis." Jean took a deep breath, lifting the folder in her hands. "Actually, I have plenty of basis." She opened the folder, passing copies of documents down the table to the shareholders and executives. These documents show a series of deals Richard orchestrated behind closed doors, deals that would have funneled funds away from the company and into his own pockets. "And the threats he made against me? Those are right here, documented." One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen, examined the papers closely, her expression growing more serious by the second. "These records, are they legitimate, Jean?" Helen asked, looking up at her. "Yes," Jean replied firmly. "Tracy Mitchell and I gathered everything carefully. Every document here connects Richard to these illicit deals. And if that isn't enough, there are recordings of conversations where Richard explicitly threatens me, attempting to coerce me into betraying this company." Richard's face twisted with anger, his voice low and dangerous. "You're lying," he spat. "This is a setup, orchestrated by Robert and his little assistant to drive me out of the company. None of this will hold up in court." Tracy, calm and composed, leaned forward. "Actually, Richard, everything here will hold up in court. The evidence is overwhelming, and your threats against Jean were recorded without any prompting. You brought this on yourself." The room was tense, eyes shifting from Richard's flushed face to the clear, undeniable proof spread across the table. Jean could feel the weight of each executive's gaze as they scanned the evidence, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock, and then finally to anger. Richard clenched his fists, desperation flashing across his face. "This is ridiculous," he sneered. "She's just a naive assistant who doesn't know what she's talking about. None of you honestly believe her, do you?" Jean met his eyes with steely defiance. "I may be young, but I know the difference between right and wrong. And I refuse to be intimidated by you, Richard." She turned to the rest of the room, her voice clear and confident. "I didn't come here to accuse anyone lightly. I've risked everything to ensure this company isn't torn apart by someone who's only looking out for himself. Richard doesn't deserve the trust of anyone in this room." An older executive at the far end of the table, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his tone grave. "These actions are reprehensible. If this evidence is as sound as it appears, Richard, there's no place for you in this company." Robert, who had been watching the proceedings intently, finally spoke, his voice firm. "Richard, you've put this company and its employees at risk for your own gain. Your actions not only betrayed our trust, but also endangered Jean's safety. There will be consequences." Richard's face was a mix of rage and panic, his confidence shattered. He stood up abruptly, his voice rising in desperation. "You're all fools if you think she's telling the truth. She's just Robert's pawn." Tracy shook her head, her voice filled with resolve. "This ends here, Richard. The authorities have already been notified, and they'll take it from here." At her words, two men in dark suits entered the boardroom, moving directly toward Richard. Realizing he was cornered, he backed up, casting a final venomous look at Jean. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "All of you." Jean held his gaze, unflinching.
No, Richard.
The only one who will regret this is you. With that, the authorities led him out of the boardroom, his protests fading as the doors closed behind him. The room remained silent for a long moment, everyone processing the gravity of what had just happened. Finally, Helen, the sharp-eyed board member, turned to Jean. Jean, your courage saved this company from ruin. I think I speak for everyone here when I say thank you. Jean nodded, feeling a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She glanced at Robert, who gave her a small, proud smile, and Tracy, whose steady support had made all of this possible. Robert stood up, addressing the room. We've removed a threat today, thanks to Jean's bravery and Tracy's hard work. Let's use this as an opportunity to move forward with transparency and integrity. As the meeting ended, Jean walked out alongside Robert and Tracy, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She had faced down her greatest fear and emerged victorious, protecting her family and standing up for what was right. And as she stepped out of the boardroom, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life. With Richard out of the picture, the company felt like a different place. The tension that had once plagued the office lifted, and Jean could focus on her work with newfound clarity. Robert, having finally seen through Victoria's schemes and understanding the damage her ambition had caused, made the decision to remove her from her position. It wasn't easy. Victoria had been a fixture in the company for years, but Robert knew it was time for a fresh start. Shortly after, he called Jean into his office. She was nervous, wondering if her role would shift now that the chaos was over, but as soon as she entered, Robert's warm smile reassured her. Jean, he began, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, I want you to know how deeply grateful I am for everything you've done. You've shown courage and loyalty that goes beyond anything I expected. Jean felt a blush creep onto her cheeks, both humbled and encouraged by his words. Thank you, Robert. But I was just doing what felt right. You've given me more than anyone ever has. I couldn't stand by and let Richard ruin everything you've worked for. Robert nodded, his expression softening. You don't give yourself enough credit. You've been a pillar of strength in the middle of a storm, and that's something rare. I've decided to promote you to a position where your talents can truly shine. I want you to oversee project management for the entire office. We need someone we can trust to lead with integrity. Jean's eyes widened, the reality of his words settling over her like a weight. Robert, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected. Say you'll take it, he replied with a small smile. I can't think of anyone more suited for it. She accepted, her heart racing as they shook hands. She left his office feeling both nervous and excited, thinking of how much had changed. She had arrived here as an outsider, yet now she was part of something bigger than she'd ever imagined. At home, the changes were just as profound. Noah, who had watched the fallout of Richard's schemes unfold, seemed to be reevaluating his own choices. Jean noticed a shift in him, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, Noah joined her, carrying a stack of textbooks and notes. Jean, he began, his tone tentative. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I know I haven't exactly been easy on you. She looked up, surprised. Noah, you don't have to. No, let me finish, he insisted. I've been acting out because I didn't think anyone understood me. But Robert, he got it. And I realized that maybe I don't have to be the person I was becoming. I want to do better, for you, for Olivia, for myself. Jean felt a surge of pride and relief as she reached out to squeeze his hand. You don't know how much that means to me, Noah. I always believed in you. We both did. With Robert's guidance, Noah had been working on finding new focus in his studies. His teachers noticed, and gradually, he was distancing himself from the negative influences that had once held him back. It was as if he'd been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. Meanwhile, Olivia blossomed in ways that left Jean amazed. The dance classes Robert had arranged had become her sanctuary, a place where she could truly express herself. Jean attended every performance, watching in awe as her sister transformed on stage. The shy 12-year-old was now a poised, confident young dancer who captivated audiences, and each performance filled Jean with joy and pride. One evening after a recital, Olivia rushed over to Jean, her face glowing with excitement. Jean, did you see? I did the turn I was struggling with. Jean hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with emotion. You were incredible, Liv. I'm so proud of you. This is just the beginning. As they left the recital hall, Robert, who had quietly attended, joined them, congratulating Olivia on her performance. The three of them walked together, and Jean felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was the family she'd been fighting for, the moment she dreamed of when she'd been struggling to keep everything afloat. Strich. In the following weeks, Robert and Jean found themselves drawn even closer. With the conflicts behind them, there was room to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing slowly between them. One evening, after a long day at the office, they lingered in the quiet of Robert's office, watching the lights of the city below. Jean, Robert began, his voice soft, you've become more than just someone I work with. You've become incredibly important to me. She looked at him, feeling her heart skip a beat. Robert, I feel the same way. I didn't expect any of this, least of all to find someone who believes in me like you do. They shared a quiet moment, the understanding between them deepening as they acknowledged what had been building for so long. They weren't just allies anymore, bound by loyalty and respect. They were something more, something that felt like hope. With renewed purpose, Jean and Robert looked ahead, no longer weighed down by the shadows of betrayal or mistrust. They had each other, their friends, and their shared vision. Together, they would forge a new future, one built on resilience, integrity, and love.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.